In Shakespearean drama also, you see this situation where God has become important, but the human element of Shakespearean drama is what makes it unique. And it is this reason that you will find Shakespeare is mentioned as a humanist in most of the history of literatures. You will not find Shakespeare just as a mere dramatist. The element of human understanding, the psychological depth, the ability to investigate into the human mind is clearly shown in most of the truly critical writings on Shakespeare. At the very outset, I would like to reveal the source of my understanding of Shakespeare, though it's not limiting in that sense. But yes, A.C. Bradley has been the core person whom I have read enough to understand what Shakespeare is to be thought of. Now, the second part here I've mentioned is it breaks away from the Aristotelian tradition. The core importance of the Aristotelian tradition, or the main feature, is that in the Aristotelian tradition, you have time, place, and action, which are of key importance. You cannot do without time, place, and action. You have to understand that once Shakespeare started writing drama, he started breaking away from these notions. He said that he will, or rather through his plays, he said that he will interact with uh, ideas from different parts of the world. In some sense, his plays were cosmopolitan. When he was writing about Denmark, for instance, he was not only focused on Denmark, but he was also writing about characters coming from different parts of the world. There is mention of England, there is mention of different parts of the world. So it is cosmopolitan in that sense. It is not limited to a particular place. When we talk of the unity of time, what Greek tragedy has to tell us is that the whole action will end in 24 hours. Shakespeare's plays span over the time frame of years. They don't limit themselves to hours. So the unity of time is broken. The unity of action is also broken, and that is broken in a very interesting way, because Shakespeare believes a lot in devices like the soliloquy. He believes in narration of actions from the past. So for instance, if you look at Hamlet and he is ruminating a lot, there are chances that he is ruminating both about the future and about the past. So none of the Shakespearean characters are just following this linear narrative. The linear narrative pattern is more given to the Greek drama, where you see the story from the perspective of a biographical historical narrative. If you look at Oedipus the King for a contrast, you will understand that Oedipus sort of conveys his history from the past, and then at a point he remembers, or he comes to remember, find out that he has committed a sin, and then his life progresses towards the future. There is not much of the mixed way of expression in Shakespearean drama, in Greek drama rather. So now, what is unity? I have already explained that the three unities of time, place, and action, they are sort of violated in Shakespearean plays. Now, the plot of tragedy is taken from various historical sources. They are taken from folk tales like Saxo Grammaticus, and Saxo Grammaticus basically is the core source for Hamlet, which is the play for today. Now, Shakespearean tragedy was meant to be staged. Now, what does this mean? We have to understand that Shakespearean tragedy was not limited to the drawing room reading that we do today. It was meant for being shown outside on the stage, which means that it was meant for expressing to the audience. It was always an art which has to be shown to the audience, and therefore it had an impact on the audience. And remember that reader response, which is famous today, was also important in that time. Theater response was very important. So what Shakespeare was actually expecting from its audience was that they will become part of the play. And this element can be clearly seen in a lot of tragedies and comedies both. In the tragedies, you will see the audience weeping. Literally, even today, you will find the audience weeping. And in comedies, you will find the audience coming together and mixing with the characters in the play in forms like the Mask, where there was song and music, and the audience will come together with the characters of the play. So remember that it was something to be performed on the stage and not limited to the books that we read today. Can we have the next slide, Payal? Uh, so the four major tragedies which are mentioned in any key course on literature, people can say it's canonical, but then that is how it is. The four tragedies that are there are Macbeth, Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear. Macbeth is this military general who has committed the sin of regicide. Consequently, as the theme of drama works, he has committed regicide, and therefore he is he is the criminal, the culprit. So he has to suffer. The suffering is brought about by several means, by the supernatural, by the people around him, by plotters around him, and the result is obviously fall and death. So this is the outline in most of the Shakespearean tragedies. How that tragedy is brought about is the play that Shakespeare is showing you. The core movement of any tragedy is from the classical error, the error in judgment, which is called hamartia, to moving away and making that mistake, and then only realizing it at a state where you cannot now go back on your action. Your action has already taken place. So as a tragic character, you no more have the situation in control. So all that the audience now has to see is the downfall of the character and learn from that downfall perhaps towards the end. Hamlet, to which I will dedicate the larger part of this lecture, is based on four basic elements, that is incest, betrayal, distrust, and deaths. Now, these four are in no way limiting of the entire beautiful sort of outline of Hamlet or the creation of Hamlet. Incest, betrayal, and distrust and deaths are just the core repeating themes in the soliloquies of Hamlet, and distrust is the general mood. Betrayal is the essence of the drama. Now, betrayal can also be seen more strongly in King Lear and also in Macbeth. Uh, these themes are in no way exclusive. So I have mentioned it here, but it does not mean that if I've mentioned distrust with Hamlet, it cannot be there in Othello. Othello is one person who is very distrustful. That's why you see the themes repeating. So don't think of these themes as limiting. This is just a very cursory view of a presentation developed quite in a hurry. So yeah, Othello here is about jealousy. Iago is the supreme villain. He is able to uh, change the mindset of people, and not by any force. He is just using his ability to influence people. His influence is so powerful that it's very difficult to come away from that. He speaks so powerfully. It's almost like he speaks venom into the ears of Othello. One important reference that I have missed here in my presentation is the repetitive calling of Othello as the Moor, which opens up space for post-colonial understanding of the text Othello. Now, when we read these texts in retrospect, we are actually applying 20th century theory to Shakespearean drama. It does not mean that these tragedies do not have anything to offer, or that they should be studied only in terms of the plot. Obviously, you have scope for applying theories and trying to find out how it was a tragedy for a particular limited audience. That is why literary theory also becomes important here. Now, with King Lear, self-inflated image is the problem, which creates his situation of being thrown away. He is not able to relate to his situation, and he feels thrown away. And the daughters that he thought were his favorite daughters betray him. This betrayal is so terse that he's not able to handle that, so painful that he's not able to handle that. He's literally exposed to nature, and then we see the death of Lear. In all these tragedies, you will notice that none of these tragedies have limited death. You always have the element of tragic waste, which I have mentioned in Macbeth. one of my slides, which is going to come up. So it's not that only one character dies, there'll be multiple character dying deaths on the Shakespearean stage. That is why Shakespearean tragedy is different from Greek tragedy also, because Greek tragedy took death to the hindsight. It would always try to hide the death scene. But in Shakespearean tragedy, you don't have that. Shakespeare is a lover of spectacle. He tries to show you that. And so he will show you death on the stage itself. Pyle, can we have the next slide? So the four parts that I have mentioned here is exposition, rising action, climax, and falling action. The fifth one is catastrophe, but I'll come to that later. So when I say exposition, I mean that a particular set of actions is brought about in the play. Certain things happen when you see the play, and most of these plays begin in media res, which means the whole action begins in a situation where there is a lot of tension already in the air. The tension could be because of various reasons. It could be political tensions, it could be historical tensions going on, it could be introspective tensions going on, or within family feuds, any kind of tension. But there's always a tension right at the beginning of Shakespearean tragedy, because Shakespeare is the kind of writer who does not like to waste time. He will give you metaphors straight away at the beginning of the play, and therefore most of the opening acts of Shakespeare are very important. It's very important to understand the opening acts of Shakespeare, because he gives you the keys to understand the future of the tragedy while he is writing the opening act itself. And then again, the last act is also important, where you reach the result of this much of the action. So exposition is that bringing up of mixed up events together, and then you slowly have what is called rising action. So the conflict grows, and the characters, they intermingle with each other, and there's always often a fight for power, a fight for place in the plot. The characters seem to be trying to gain the attention of the reader. If you look at it in terms of drama, the attention of the audience. So you always have this good evil sort of dichotomy going on. And the beauty about Shakespearean play is that you never have a perfect good or a perfect evil character. There's no one who is perfectly good or perfectly evil, because if you did that, then you will be creating stereotypes, and that is not what Shakespeare was doing. The next part that I would now go on to discuss is the element of climax in Shakespearean drama. So what is so unique about the climax part of Shakespearean drama, which makes it beautiful? The core elements of a Shakespearean drama are at its extreme during the climax, which means that if you are looking at some very vicious character like Iago, for instance, Iago would be doing his best maneuver in a scene where you are having the climax. Now, this is also a hint to try and recognize the part which is a climax in a particular drama. Generally, you will find the climax to be placed around the last part of the third act, or the beginning of the fourth act as at maximum. So these are the places where you should look at to locate the climax. In the case of Hamlet, for instance, you have the climax at that particular scene where Hamlet, to my understanding, where Hamlet gets the first chance to kill King Claudius, and he gives up on the plan. This is such a major sort of delay in the plan of Hamlet that we have a scene of events that will unfold, and which will create a situation from which Hamlet or the other characters can not step back. If we try to twist the play a bit, and we imagine that Hamlet had killed Claudius in that scene, what would have happened to that drama from then on? What would have happened is Hamlet would have taken the revenge and fulfilled the promise to his father, senior Hamlet, but he did not do that. He, remember, is a procrastinator throughout the play, and that perhaps is the tragic flaw of Hamlet. Perhaps if Hamlet was not a procrastinator, he would have taken revenge, and the whole play would have been resolved right at that moment. So from the point of climax, you have this realization of where the drama is moving towards as an audience, but the characters, the core character, still has to make the major decision about what is to be done. So therefore, climax is important. Falling action is that part of the play where you have the conflict between the hero and the villain going at its full pace. You have this conflict at its full pace, which means that you have to now see the play in terms of rapid action. The denouement is never slow action in Shakespeare. You have fights occurring, you have verbal dialogues which are very, very heroic in some sense. All the tragic plays are also heroic, philosophical. Hamlet is the most philosophical tragic play. And if the UGC net asks you, and I believe most of the aspirants here also want to work for UGC net, if UGC net asks you which is the most philosophical play, you can clearly go for Hamlet as the choice. Now, going to catastrophe, why is it that we use the term catastrophe for the end of a tragedy? Again, I will use the device of differentiation to make this clear. In a Shakespearean comedy, you have the resolution in the fact that people will be able to discuss their activities, and at the end you will have a happy ending. There'll be a marriage or something. But in a catastrophe, you have anxiety, you have angst, and all that angst is built up and you have a sort of complete destruction of the plot. You have people dying on the stage, you have a spectacle of death, and you have a hopeless kind of an ending. But all you get out of it is a purgation, and that purgation is the main element, or the main purpose rather, of a Shakespearean tragedy. As an audience, you feel that perhaps you could have been in the position of the actor, and you could have been doing the same mistake, and therefore pity and fear become important. Can we have the next slide, Pyle? So yeah, here you will see some of the overlaps between what I have already said in the previous slide and here. Tragic hero is a person who is brought out from a very high stature. He is a king or a prince or a general. He is not a person of middle class standing. He is not a person from the community. He is a high hero. So tragic hero is also having a tragic flaw. He always has a false understanding of himself, or a false understanding of people around him, or a false understanding of his self-worth. Some sort of mistake is always there on the part of the hero. He's always at a situation where he will make a mistake, and this mistake is not born out of the doings of gods like in Greek tragedy. This mistake is born out of the the actions of the character. So hamartia, or tragic flaw, becomes important because it is this tragic flaw which will lead to what is going to happen in the future in the tragedy. Now, if you look at some of the examples, Othello's tragic flaw is his jealousy and his blind belief of Iago's words. Jealousy is his tragic flaw. Hamlet's tragic flaw is procrastination and his overly philosophical nature. He is not able to come to terms with the fact that his father is now dead and he should be in action. If you contrast the action of Hamlet and Laertes, you will understand what is missing in Hamlet. While Laertes is ready to take revenge directly, Hamlet is making this mistake and he's procrastinating. So his procrastination leads to not only his death, but a lot of deaths around him, and thus tragedy happens. Catharsis is purgation of audience's emotions, which is the key idea of any tragedy. As a tragedian, the core purpose is that you should be able to create catharsis. Now, this is said by Greek tragedians, and this was also retained in a Shakespearean tragedy. So perhaps this is the classical purpose of a tragedy, that you should have some sort of catharsis going on in the mind of the audience. Now, anagnorisis is another term which appears again and again in terms of Shakespearean drama and Greek drama also. What happens in anagnorisis is that there is this reversal of fortune. In Greek drama, this reversal of fortune is brought about by the doings of God. as I already emphasized, in Shakespearean drama, on the contrary, this purgation and this reversal of fortune, rather, is brought about by the actions of the character, which means that the character will take such a step which cannot be taken back, and therefore there will be a fall from grace, and that is reversal of fortune. He will no more be the big, the mighty king. Slowly he will fall down, and this downfall is actually the subject of tragedy, and therefore seen in the latter acts of Shakespearean tragedy. Now, arousal of pity and fear in the audience is obvious result of tragedy, and I don't think we need to emphasize more on that. Pity for the protagonist and fear for the self. Now, this has to be emphasized upon. When, as an audience, you look at a Shakespearean drama, you feel pity for the protagonist. You feel that uh, it should not have happened to the protagonist, even though the protagonist has a flaw. The magic of a Shakespearean play is that you feel pity for the protagonist. You feel that it's painful that the person has to go through, and such a huge king has to go through such difficult times. So this dichotomy between the stature of the king or the general, and the scene that he has to go through, the pain that he has to go through, is what creates pity in the mind of the audience. And fear for the self, fear is aroused because we as audience feel that we could have been in the place of the character itself, and we would be suffering equally. So the reason being that we could have the same mistakes within ourselves. We could be privy to the same mistakes which we think the core character of the tragedy or the protagonist of the tragedy is displaying. Shakespearean drama is, in a sense, an introspection, specifically the tragedy. It is always an introspection of the self. If you look at Hamlet, he is mostly ruminating throughout his works. He is not focused only on the externalities of the situation. He is too brooding, and to some extent, his brooding nature is also counterproductive. He thinks about his past too much, and that fails him towards the end, and procrastinates his action. There is debate about how it was moral or immoral to judge Hamlet's action, but still we cannot discount the fact that introspection plays a key role in most of the tragedies of Shakespeare. In some plays, this introspection comes in the earlier stages of the tragedy itself, or in some other plays, it happens in the later part of the tragedy. For instance, in Hamlet, you see the introspection right from the beginning. Uh, in King Lear, on the contrary, Lear is introspecting only at the end of the play. Uh, when you look at a Macbeth, Macbeth is introspecting perhaps towards the very, very end of the play. And therefore, all these tragedies can be read in terms of a sort of movement from darkness to light, which means that towards the initial stages of the play, the character is in darkness. If you even look at Hamlet, he is in darkness about whether who is the murderer of his father. There is dim light when he sees the ghost, but slowly, when the play ends, then he is in complete light about who is the killer. But his tragic flaw of procrastination is still working. So he procrastinates despite knowing intrinsically that the killer is Claudius. He takes time with killing Claudius, and it is in this sense that this play is more intricate than it seems at the outside. So, which means that Shakespeare is actually a great psychologist. He's playing with the psyche of the audience. Now, I will go on to discuss one last point, that character is most important in Shakespearean plot. The plays of Shakespeare, specifically tragedy, is all about character. This is also true in a comedy, but in a tragedy, clearly the building up of character is the most important, and therefore the motives are most important. The way a character behaves is most important, and that is what you should follow as a reader to understand the tragedy better. Pyle, can we have the next slide? So, yeah, technique makes Shakespearean drama unique. What are the specific techniques that Shakespearean drama uses to create the effect that it does. Soliloquy is one technique that Shakespearean drama uses strongly. In Hamlet itself, there are seven soliloquies, and they are so deep that if I went on to analyze the whole import of those seven soliloquies, that will call for a separate lecture itself. Now, in soliloquy, what we have to understand is that the writer is trying to show you the character's inside mind. He's trying to show you what the character is thinking. So he's soliloquizing. He's thinking of the past, the present, and the future at once. If you look at Hamlet's soliloquies, which are clearly the best in the set of soliloquies that Shakespeare has written, the second best that comes to my mind, and obviously in my judgment, are Macbeth's soliloquies. And we have to understand that why Hamlet's soliloquies are so special is that they're able to introspect into the mind of Hamlet. They're able to show you what's happening inside the mind of Hamlet. Aside, on the other hand, is a different device which has to do with the fact that the writer will be telling you some part of the story which is hidden for the other characters in the play, but it is only told to the audience. So that is aside, and there are a lot of asides in Shakespearean drama also. Comic relief is unique to Shakespearean drama. At this point, I would also like to point out that Shakespeare never wrote so-called quote-unquote pure tragedies or pure comedies. He wrote what a lot of critics like to refer to as tragicomedies. He always mixed the elements of tragedy and comedy, and therefore he gave comic relief to his readers. Comic relief was very important. He would often mix a certain song or a particular mask within a tragedy, and then you will see these characters uh, sort of getting a relief after a long stretch of a very suspenseful or a tragic, painful situation. So you will have the element of comic relief in most of the Shakespearean tragedies. Uh, the next part that I'll focus now upon is the supernatural. Hamlet is the best example again for the supernatural. You have this ghost playing in the beginning of the play, and the ghost is so important that it leads you to the key conflict in the play, the death of senior Hamlet, which has resulted in what has happened throughout the play. Even if you look at Macbeth, for instance, the appearance of the three witches is so central to the unfolding of the plot. The whole element of the sense of fear in the mind of a Macbeth is that element of people telling you that you are now going to get killed because the witches have prophesied so. So here, Shakespeare is obviously using the element of prophecy, which was very important to Greek drama also, but Shakespeare uses it in a very humane way. He says that you have to kind of focus on the human element, the element of fear and anxiety that arises out of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and which later uh, becomes the dagger in the air scene, is clearly more important to Shakespeare, and therefore Shakespeare is different from the Greek dramatists. He offers a psychological insight, and that I have emphasized upon already, so I think we can skip that for now. The spectacle scene is also very important. So the spectacle, what is a spectacle? What Shakespeare does with his plays is that he gives you a build-up of an action, and towards the end of the play, he offers such a scene where you will have a lot of bodies dying around you, you will have angst and anxiety built up, and then you will have distress and people falling away, and you cannot rationally explain that kind of death. So it asks a lot of questions from the inside mind of the viewer itself. And this is the core connect that plays like Hamlet still do to us. So for instance, if we look at Heather, and to me that is the best retelling. I have detailed Heather in a later slide in this talk. So when you look at Heather, you see the whole climate of Kashmir falling, and you see a conflict completely building into the play, and then from there you want some sort of relief, and therefore you suddenly have a song coming up. So that's why Vishal Bhardwaj has been able to do justice to Shakespeare's Hamlet. Can we have the next slide? Shakespearean stage is one important thing. So Shakespeare's dramas were not written to be read. It's And the fun part is that folio, the first folio, which is known and always repeated in net examinations, was written after Shakespeare's death. So Shakespeare never wrote it for the audience to read it in rooms, and therefore I will advise that most of you should go on and watch these plays, whether in their BBC editions or in other plays that are staged around the world. There are a lot of YouTube versions available. The Shakespearean stage had only men and no women, and this, mind you, has a huge impact on how you think about a play. When the gender roles are reversed, the whole expectation from a particular actor it goes beyond the bounds. You expect femininity from a male character, and you expect maleness from a female character. In some sense, this also opens up the possibilities of queerness in Shakespearean dramaturgy. What is happening here is that if you think of a character who is playing a plot, playing a character in a Shakespearean play, then if a man is playing a woman, he is expected to have a certain kind of voice, and this voice itself will cross the boundaries of a particular kind of voice which is given to the quote unquote male, and therefore there is a possibility of queer analysis of Shakespearean plays. Cross-dressing was predominant in Shakespearean drama, more predominantly in comedy. Shakespearean stage was for common men. What I mean here is that Shakespeare never wrote for a limited audience. He was not a dramatist who was only interested in cloakroom drama, which I have emphasized again and again, which means that his dramatic theater was divided into what the critics have called the groundlings and the gentry. So the groundlings were those people who were the workers who would sit at the front of the Globe Theatre, for instance, the older Globe Theatre, not the new Globe Theatre. Mm, at this instance, it also brings to my mind that I mentioned some of the stages where Shakespearean plays were staged. The Rose, the Globe. These were some of the stages where the plays were staged, and these were all stages which had limitations of lighting. It had limitations of a particular time frame. You had to finish it within 3 hours, but that will the scenery that you show will expand up to you know 15-20 years. So those limitations had to be taken care of on the Shakespearean stage. Also, costume played a very important part in Shakespearean plays. You had characters wearing very heavy costumes, because if you had to show a king and you did not have lighting, there will always be this desire to dress your character in a certain way so that the eliteness of the character comes out. So costume obviously played a very important part. The scenes had to be imagined by the audience. Now, what do I mean here? When you are speaking on a Shakespearean stage, and even today, when there are recreations of such dramatic performances, there is not enough space given to lighting and music and sound. All these things had to be imagined by the Elizabethan audience, and in some sense, the Elizabethan audience was the most imaginative that you can think of. If you look at the other playwrights which existed in other ages, they were limited to a particular kind of helped audience. The Shakespearean tragedy was, on the contrary, based a lot on how the audience interpreted it. Pyle, can we have the next slide?
Is this the one?
Yeah, this is the one. So I'm trying to differentiate here between Shakespearean drama and Greek drama. I have already mentioned some of these points, that God plays the central role, the oracle or the temple of Delphi plays the central role. For instance, in Oedipus, the message that you get from the temple of Delphi becomes the most important. Man, on the contrary, plays the central role. Now, this point is true in two senses. It's true in the sense that man as human being is important in Shakespearean plays. If you think about it deeply, it is also to be understood that in some sense, the male had to play the key role in Shakespearean drama, which means that the men were most important. Most of the tragedies, at least, have very few lady characters playing key roles. For instance, if you look at Hamlet, Ophelia is seen, but she is only seen in relation to Hamlet. She is happy or unhappy in relation to Hamlet. Only specifically in the play Macbeth, Lady Macbeth is seen as playing a very strong part in the action of the hero of that play. So, except Macbeth, the other plays are limiting. Death on the stage is a very important element of Shakespearean drama. You always see corpses on the stage in Shakespearean drama, and therefore there's an element of grotesque tragedy in Shakespearean drama. The revenge tragedies, which already in the pre-Shakespearean times also had the element of death, are clearly seen in Shakespearean drama. Minimal or no poetic justice is one important thing. Now, what does this mean? That Shakespeare is not interested in offering you an answer which is sort of relieving. It will make you think when you leave the play. So, when you look at Hamlet, for instance, you are not given a perfect answer. You have to think what's going to happen next. Was it true that Hamlet got justice even in death? These kind of questions haunt you when you see a Shakespearean play. Now, Shakespearean drama uses chance sparingly, only as much as human error gives it the scope. So, he's a master artist. He will not leave the key elements to the drama. He will limit the thinking of the audience to the things that are happening on the stage. So, chance is limited, which means action is important. This is what I mean when I say chance is limited. Action or the action of the character is important. The next part that I'll focus on is in the next slide. Pile, can we have the next slide? गेट बंद करो, गेट बंद करो. The next part is yeah, so a few more terms here. I have listed out few more terms which are generally listed in Greek tragedy, sorry, in Shakespearean tragedy, my mistake, forgive me. So revenge tragedy is one element which is particular to Hamlet. What do I mean when I say revenge tragedy? What have the critics meant? There is always this element of revenge in Shakespearean drama. You have an act which is committed in the past, specifically in Hamlet. Uh, so what's happening here is you have Hamlet knowing from a supernatural announcement that his father has been murdered, and the whole act that he has to commit is to take revenge for that action. So Hamlet has been categorized and as a revenge tragedy. In the later slides, I have to focus on Hamlet, so I have focused here only on Hamlet. Tragicomedy, I already mentioned, is the mixing of tragic and comic ways. Now, this is not just a juxtaposition of tragic and comic elements. It is a very masterly juxtaposition. And that is what calls for a very close reading of Shakespearean texts. We cannot do justice to Shakespearean drama in a limited talk like this. Groundlings and gentry, I already mentioned what they mean. They are different people who visited the Shakespearean theater, and the groundlings were the poor people basically who paid less for going to the same theater, saw the same drama, but they had their own kind of fun in the drama because Shakespeare would never use the high class language, so to say. He would give you sort of abuses also within the drama, or fun burlesques within the drama, on which these groundlings would laugh. The gentry, on the other hand, will be more interested in the revelation of the tragic character and the pain that happens when Hamlet, for instance, dies. Now, again, this is judgmental of the groundlings, but what I mean here is that the element of the fun is more important to the groundlings because perhaps they would be not easily able to understand the deeper meanings um, of a speech in Hamlet, but they will be able to understand the funny parts of a Hamlet, which are few and far between. The next part here is a correlation between the natural and human world, which means that Shakespeare has never limited himself to either the natural world or the human world. He's not a realist in the cut copy paste sense. That is my way of understanding Shakespeare, that he's not cutting, copying, and pasting for you. He's mixing the natural and the human world and therefore creating these beautiful tragedies. Revelation, or the moment of revelation, is very important. The element of surprise is very important. When you discover slowly what is happening, then you react to the situation. Now, this reaction is only after the revelation has happened. For instance, once you have discovered that Claudius is the real murderer, only then, as the audience, you start to relate to the situation of Hamlet and the maddened, sort of half maddened soliloquies that he delivers on the stage all alone. Next slide, Pal. Yeah, so this is the famous two pictures. This is from Hamlet. Now, obviously, this is a recreation. You go back to some of the representations of Hamlet and see this skull. This skull represents death, and you see this funny, rather funny Hamlet looking at the skull. In the movie Haider, you have a more intense Shahid Kapoor looking at the skull. So what is happening here is that this skull is of a friend of Hamlet who is already passed away, and Uric perhaps is the name, if I'm pronouncing it correct. So this direct confrontation between a living man and the skull suggests that death is a reality, and it is in this sense that this play is existential. The characters in Shakespearean tragedy, specifically in Hamlet, are strongly aware of death, and death takes a very important part in Shakespearean tragedy, therefore making Shakespeare's tragedies existential. Can we have the next slide? Again, just as I mentioned, if you look at this picture, this is obviously a recreation again of Ophelia's death. You can see that Ophelia has died open-eyed. If I had to interpret this picture, I would feel that perhaps some of the desires of Ophelia are seen in those eyes and that open mouth and the flower falling there. So the way that Shakespeare creates his scenery is not just about the dialogues that he gives his characters, it's also about the setting of the play. When he mentions in the asides, or the director mentions in the asides, let the flowers fall, or let a particular kind of music play, that is a very important element of the Shakespearean stage, because that is what creates the whole experience of a Shakespearean tragedy. Can we have the next slide? Yeah, I'm sorry, I think I've reached the end. Thank you. It was amazing. Thank you. Amazing because I had such a large audience.
Okay,
Can
fine.
I have the questions back?
Yeah, we have three questions, and I'll just start with one that is easy to answer, and because it's again asking for lists. So, so do you? Okay, okay, something because you've been talking of how Hamlet as a play is philosophical, as a character is given to philosophical musings. So, what is the philosophical, metaphysical meaning of the skull scene in Hamlet and Macbeth? Do you do they contradict each other?
Um, my first acceptance is that I'm not directly aware of the skull scene in Macbeth, but I would like to emphasize about the element of death in Macbeth and Hamlet. So the key difference
The
between
grave
death in
first scene, I think that is what.
the first scene, whose
They
skull
went
is that?
into the grave digger scene. That's what I feel.
But the gravedigger's scene is not in Macbeth, I believe.
Let me see the question. It says just the skull scene.
Skull scene in Hamlet, right?
Yes, and then a scene in Macbeth that I don't know which scene he refers is referring to, but he's talking of the skull scene in Macbeth also.
Macbeth. So what I will do is I will transfer the metaphor of the skull to what it actually represents. And wherever Shakespeare uses skull, or for that matter, any dramatist uses skull, he's using it for the philosophical value of the skull, which means that he's trying to talk about death. In Hamlet, Shakespeare is talking about the inevitability of death, and in Macbeth, on the contrary, you see the fear of death towards the end of the tragedy. So, the when you talk of philosophical difference, the philosophical difference is that in Hamlet you have this ruminating character who always keeps thinking about death already when the play begins. On the contrary, in Macbeth, the essence of death is only the fear of death, and it is not some kind of peace in death that Macbeth is thinking about. When you look at a Hamlet who is torn apart, or a Heather who is torn apart in the recreation, then you are perhaps thinking that Hamlet is perhaps waiting for death. He's already dejected. On the contrary, in Macbeth, you have a kind of death where the characters are scared of death. The key protagonist does not want to die. So this is the key difference, the philosophical difference: waiting for death and not wanting death at all. That would be my answer.
Okay. I think he's mistaken because the skull scene is in Hamlet and not in Macbeth, and even the gravedigger scene, for that matter, is in
Is in Hamlet.
Hamlet and not in Macbeth. So I'm trying to unmute Nisarga. Nisarga, can you please introduce yourself? Because,
Yeah, hello.
yeah,
Yeah, I had some problem with my audio actually.
yeah,
So now it's all right. Yeah.
can you just turn on the camera? Okay, so till then we can take another question. How do you explain the grotesque in Shakespearean tragedies? The spelling of Shakespearean is incorrect, whoever this is. Most of the time in tragedy, we can find all characters follow the sublime. It will be clearer if you give some example of the grotesque and the sublime from this tragedy, from his
Uh, yeah,
tragedy.
is that the whole question?
Yeah, that is the question. So the difference between the grotesque and the sublime, using some of these tragedies by Shakespeare.
I would like to point out that the from my understanding the difference between the grotesque and the sublime is not the key point here. I think there is always this grotesque mixing into the sublime, and the grotesque creating the sublime rather for Shakespeare. So when you look at a lot of deaths happening on any Shakespearean stage for that matter, what is happening is you have dead bodies strewn around you, and it is that grotesqueness, that inability to look at the stage, which creates the wonder at human reality. So when Hamlet is talking about what a piece of work is man, he already has the memory of the death of his father in his mind. So death is already present throughout the play. And so it is not that sublime is different from the grotesque. It is actually that the grotesque becomes the medium for expressing the sublime. And the scenic example that I would like to give you is the death scene, the skull scene first, where Hamlet is talking to his friend's skull. It is mentioned in the play that the character who is already dead and whose skull that is the old friend of Hamlet. And Hamlet is talking to that skull and saying that I'm also as temporary as you. And therefore, this becomes important because, as I told you, the philosophical element is shown through the symbol of the skull. The second point, when you look at the death scene of Ophelia and you see people jumping into Ophelia's graves for different reasons, there is Laertes jumping into the grave. Both these have their motivations. Hamlet's motivation is of an unrequited love and his very recent unkind behavior to Ophelia. So perhaps you have this character already repenting. So this is also grotesque to the audience because you at once feel angry at Hamlet for doing what he has done to Ophelia, and at once feel pitiful for Hamlet for what has been done to Hamlet because he could not react the proper way. And therefore, there have been questions about the mindset of Hamlet. Okay. So, what I'm trying to suggest here is that it is through the grotesque that you reach the sublime in Shakespearean tragedy. It is not differentiated. That's my answer.
Okay. Does whose question was that? I hope that answers. Nisarga, do you have something to say on that? Some take on the grotesque and the sublime?
No, I think that is beautifully answered. The
Okay.
entire
I
sublime being actually the grotesque only. Yeah.
Yes. And if you want to know more about sublime and what the sublime is, you can refer back to Longinus, and then you also have a philosophical inquiry into the origins of our ideas of sublime by Edmund Burke. And I think this sublime and beautiful and how sublime and beautiful are different. Edmund Burke explains it beautifully in this work, The Philosophical Inquiry. The work has been asked, the name of the writer has been asked in one of the entrance examinations, and I think it was University of Hyderabad
Yeah.
previous year. If I'm
And after that, Kant's critique of judgment again takes up Burke's idea of the sublime and critiques it
yeah.
further. That's another work again asked for in it.
So sublime, you can go through these 2 or 3 works and try to understand the sublime better. I think Amrit already answered your question about how sublime and the grotesque function in a Shakespearean tragedy. One question, now I don't know, it could have really different answers, and it could again be an opinion, not an answer. Uh, don't you think Ophelia is one of the weakest creations of uh, Shakespeare? Now this becomes a very subjective.
Uh, yeah, can I take a call, or while you would have something to say, or
I
shall
have
I?
something to say, but Amrit, because this is your presentation, so I think you
Okay.
should go first.
Yeah. So the thing is, when you look at Ophelia from the Shakespearean time, your take on Ophelia will be different. Now, understand that when gender studies is being done today, when Shakespeare was writing, there was no gender studies. So we are only reading these plays in retrospect, bringing in different theoretical viewpoints. And I also mentioned in my talk about the So Ophelia is a weak character only to the modern understanding, where you have this empowered woman who would not die for a lover. Okay. Now, in the Shakespearean times, there was obviously a construct of woman, and that construct of woman was well accepted. So if you critique it from the point of view of the modern understanding of woman, only then you can say that it's a weak character, because uh, nobody would feel sort of sympathy for Lady Macbeth. You know that she is the mechanizer. She is a person who is creating regicide. She is standing at the back, and this is not meant out of some misogyny for women. This is meant out of what actually happens in the play. So Shakespeare is not showing a weak character Ophelia, but he's actually showing a dedicated lover Ophelia there.
Um, okay, so yeah, I kind of agree that. So the entire idea of hermeneutics, where you have this double interpretation, where you need to also look at the context of the book was written in, and then you kind of put your the reader's interpretation into it. So you have works of Edward Hirsch Jr. about it, and how you should also consider the context in which the writing takes place, and then perhaps a kind of not just a single focal effect, but a polyfocal effect, where you try to look at a work from the point of view of the context of the writer too. What I was thinking of this of when you talk of Ophelia as a weak character, Shakespeare has written this work called Taming the Shrew. And if you read that work, it is actually about domesticating a woman, like you would domesticate a pet. Though I won't say that domesticating a pet itself is correct, because again, that is a kind of violence of inclusion. But you need to see the context from which it is coming. It is not an era when gender studies when you have the new woman, in fact, which comes very late, and then gender studies is not there. So what he is doing, he's just representing the kind of he's representing those images, those ideas of the woman that he sees around. So if you think that someone like Ophelia is weak, go and read Taming the Shrew. You'll feel that the woman there is kind of infantilized, and there she's treated as something non-human. Uh, but
I may add a point that we know about the negative capacity of Shakespeare that Keats speaks of. So, in case of Shakespeare, he suspends his own personality in order to let the others speak. For example, he makes even Shylock speak or Calvin speak. Now, any Elizabethan would be against any mainstream Elizabethan would be against a Jew or against a post-colonial subject. But then, because of this negative capacity, there is a certain space within every Shakespearean character. For example, it's there in Ophelia. It's maybe not that much navigated, but there is always a voice coming from the other side or a space for a resistance. That's what, in fact, makes Shakespeare so relevant today. Like we can adapt Shakespeare and make the others speak through Shakespeare.
Yeah,
yeah, and
just one second. I'm sorry, can I?
yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
one minute.
Yeah.
So when I talk of the adaptation of Shakespeare, which Nisarga pointed out, that's why I brought in Heather. If you look at
Mm.
the character who plays Ophelia in Heather, she
Yeah.
clearly points out and talks to Polonius, the referred Polonius in that story, and she says, "I have loved you," and she's a Kashmiri, so she shares this in a very broken English. She says, "I have loved you, and you have cheated me," which means I have loved you and you have cheated me in return, because the kind of response that you are expecting from Ophelia is already given in this re-rendering of that Shakespearean play, where Ophelia is clearly telling her father that you have used me as an object to kind of have that royal bond with the king.
Yeah, and I would just add to this that if you want, there are actually many adaptations. Not only Heather, we know Heather because like for Bollywood, but there have been Hollywood adaptations and there have been literary adaptation. If I remember it correctly, there is a work by Toni Morrison, which is again on Desdemona. And there you find, so in Shakespeare, Desdemona is someone to whom things happen. But here, Desdemona is someone who speaks. Desdemona, and then there is a character, Barbara, who's Desdemona's, again, Afro-American mate. And these two characters are given a central stage in Desdemona by Toni Morrison. And again, it is a modern rendering. It is a more, if you can call it a feminist rendering, call it a feminist rendering, but it is a modern rendering of, again, Othello. So you see that this is happening. It's not that Shakespeare stopped there. You have Heather, you have Toni Morrison's Desdemona. You again have a Hollywood film, the letter O by Tim Blake. So these are the modern adaptations of, actually there is a list of adaptations which we can talk of, and there can be an entire session dedicated to adaptations of Shakespeare, and we can go on talking about it and how it has been. So if you want to see how modern rendering takes place, then you should read this work by Toni Morrison. It's called Desdemona. You also have a Pulitzer Prize winning author, Jane Taylor, who writes writes a re-rendering, writes a adaptation of Taming the Shrew, because Taming the Shrew is, if you read it from a feminist perspective, it is a very anti-feminist text. So she writes The Vinegar Girl, and Vinegar Girl is kind of a modern rendering of Taming the Shrew. So there are ample examples where writers have felt that these tales can be adapted to the modern discourse, to the modern situation. So we can also have a session someday on that. But for now, what I remember is The Vinegar Girl and Desdemona. You also have one work by, I'm just forgetting the name.
I would like to add Tom Stoppard's
Yeah,
Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
yeah, that one
An
work is,
excellent work.
yeah, next favorite. You have Tom Stoppard, and what I was actually talking of was Margaret Atwood. Hawkseed by Margaret Atwood is actually a literary adaptation of The Tempest. So because these writers are important. Then you have Jeanette Winterson, and Jeanette Winterson's The Gap of Five, which is a modern re-adaptation of The Winter's Tale. So all these works, I think from that point of view, it is very important. And also for understanding how Shakespeare can be kind of adapted to modern times, you should go through all these works. You should once at least try and read these works. Okay, because I think that answers your questions. Uh, okay. Okay, someone says that we need a session on adaptations. Fine. I can send you a list though after this session. Okay, something about the Oedipus complex. So, so do you think that Hamlet was suffering from Oedipus complex? See, all these are again theories that have been put onto the text. You can or you cannot take them seriously. It's up to you. Or he was disgusted by the fact that his mother was married by his beloved father's murderer. So, what is your take on the delay of action on the part of Hamlet?
So yeah, I'll first answer the latter part of the question, then I'll go to Oedipus complex.
Yeah.
Procrastination is the major reason. Actually, I mentioned it as the tragic flaw of Hamlet. So what Hamlet is doing is he's procrastinating his action because he is in a double bind. He is in the first bind of being the son of his father and he has to take that revenge. And the second bind is that he has to be morally upright in dispatching the murderer of his father. Because as a Christian, we are not told about Shakespeare's whether being Christian or not, but Hamlet is not just a Christian but also a true prince. He wants to be honest to even a murderer. So he will not take that step unless he's completely sure that the killer is Claudius himself. So he takes a lot of time deciding that. And then you also have some sort of feeling of shakiness in Hamlet's character, because every time he's about to take a decision, there is always this counter thought that appears in his mind. And that is why you see him soliloquizing so much. He talks about what happened before. He generally does not talk about what I am doing now, except in terms of my madness. He talks about what happened before and what is going to happen in the future. What I'm doing now is also repressed in that play, in some sense, because he's trying to feign the personality of a madman. So he's not allowed to show himself as he's thinking. So only in slight asides and in the actions of Hamlet, you're able to see the distress that he's going through. And therefore, there is this element of procrastination. There is no direct connection between the Oedipal complex and procrastination. That would be
Okay.
that would be making a call that perhaps Hamlet wanted to possess his mother. That has been the kind of reading, but that has been a reading by psychologists who want to force psychology onto Shakespeare.
See, I would say that if you see it from the psychological, no, the psychoanalytical point of view, you can say like few people do feel there are studies which kind of try to uh, associate this delay in action with the Oedipus complex. Reason being that so you I'll just give you the example of Hyder, or just let us take the Michel play. You see that if we consider the Oedipus complex, the thing is that the uncle Claudius is what Hamlet would like to be. So perhaps that is why he cannot kill someone he would want to be. You cannot kill your aspiration. In fact, the movie Hyder, Vishal Bhardwaj's Hyder, you see that he doesn't murder the uncle. There he doesn't even kill. He picks up the stone or something to smash his head, but then he stops and then he moves aside. So the thing is that perhaps there is this idea. Well, that if you go by the Oedipus approach, by this Oedipus complex, and you try to associate, then there is perhaps this idea that Claudius is actually what Hamlet would like to be, and therefore this not trying to kill the aspiration or not trying to kill the person I want to be.
One
There
more
is
addition.
conflict.
Yeah, one more addition. If you look at the ghost's command to Hamlet, he says that leave her to God's will. Leave your mother to your God's will. So in not killing his mother, and if you look at the scene where he goes to his mother's room and he reprimands her very bitterly, that you have created this? Are you not ashamed of yourself? This is the basic import of that whole dialogue. He's saying that you have brought incest to the bed of Denmark. Are you not ashamed of yourself? So when you look at this, there is not much incest involved here. There is not much desire to possess your mother sexually involved here. What he's protecting there is his rightful step as one, the king or prince of that place, and second, his duty to his father. That is why he does not kill his mother, in my understanding.
So
Well, let me share one anecdote on this point. How critics impose their theology, I would say theology even, upon a certain play. I went to Hyder, seeing Hyder actually with a Laka study group. And after the film ended, I came out, and I won't name those people, but after the film ended, their main objection to Hyder was that before filming Hyder, Bhardwaj didn't read Laka.
This is amazing.
yeah, this this is really, I don't find sense in it, because you need to read
Hilariously amazing.
Shakespeare to kind of readapt Shakespeare, and then you have your imagination. Why should we read Laka to readapt Shakespeare? Uh, okay, so yeah, perhaps you just can look it via various conduits. Like your openings could be different. It could be as a as a son, Hamlet as a son. Then you can read Hamlet as a Renaissance man, and then you can read Hamlet as a Christian, and then Hamlet perhaps with more of psychoanalytical criticism imposed into it, uh, having the Oedipus complex. All the ways are open to you, and nothing would be incorrect. One question, just because I had to answer this, someone asked for the essays that you can read. I think you have Hamlet and its problems, and it has always been asked in net. Again, something that the question setters or the examiners love to ask about. It is a work, it is an essay by T.S. Eliot. Yeah, Hamlet and its problems, where Hamlet is an artistic failure according to Eliot. And then you have A.C. Bradley, as Amrit mentioned. I have that book. Actually, I have that book in Delhi. I could have just shown you the book, but I can't. Yes, you have AC Bradley, and then you have, obviously, you have Elsie Knight, and the very famous essay, how many children had Lady Macbeth? How many children had Lady Macbeth? So a 1933 essay, you can also read that. If you don't get to read that, you can read the summary. That's it.
And for a more postmodern turn to, if you are interested in putting theory into Shakespeare, then read Harold Bloom. He will talk everything other than what Shakespeare has to say in the play. So
Yeah,
go for it.
and the anxiety of influence, if you read Bloom, please go and understand this, because again, this term is something that your examiners love to ask. What is anxiety of influence, and who coined the term? And again, a lot of questions around that. And if we sit down to discuss Bloom, it would be another section perhaps. So let us, okay, other questions on Hamlet? Okay, I'll just mention one thing because it just came into my mind. I'm sorry if I interrupt or digress from the path. Because Amrit discussed few terms. One term, that is anachronism, is very important when we are studying Shakespeare, because Shakespeare really didn't care about being very precise or being very correct. You know, even the unity of time, place, and action has been challenged. So anachronism is when things are not according to the time, and in many plays of Shakespeare you find that anachronism there. So you have what is the work, you have Julius Caesar, where in Act 2, Scene 1, he mentions the clock. Now, obviously, clock and a Greco-Roman period doesn't go together, so that is anachronism. You don't, clocks weren't invented at that point. Then you have the mention of doublet in Julius Caesar. Doublet, again, was not worn by Roman kings. In Hamlet, you have the University of Wittenberg, which university was not founded when Hamlet, when the anachronism again, when the time that discusses it, and the university was not founded at that point. Then you have Macbeth, and Macbeth mentions dollar. So dollar as a word did not exist in the time that Macbeth takes place, Act 1, Scene 2. So these are certain anachronisms that are there in Shakespearean plays. So it was not perfect. Another point that I would like to mention, the unity of time and action was something that the Greco-Roman dramatists discussed. But the unity of place is a Renaissance invention. So they kind of associated the unity of action to the universe in unity of place. Unity of place is never clearly written in any of the Greco-Roman criticisms. So texts. So just remember this: the idea of unity of place comes from the Renaissance dramatists, the Italians, basically, not the Indians, not the English, but the Italians. Okay, so yeah, next, other questions. Do we have any other question? Can you find other questions? I think we have answered. Did Shakespeare write plays and tragedies to educate the audiences with Christian virtues? Or did he write to subvert the hegemonic Christian social order
No, no.
through Shylock and say through the socially excluded subaltern witches of Macbeth?
Uh,
Very hard to say. Even in Life of, where you have this preface to Shakespeare, Johnson actually mentions how he was just concerned with making money, and he would write the end of his play in a real hurry. So I don't think even the idea of what I am doing for the society or social justice and subalterns not being a word even there. So personally, for me, these questions do not have that importance while reading Shakespeare. But again, your takes, Nisarga and
yeah,
Amrit.
yeah. The political reading of a particular play is what is making you think like that. So what has happened is, in the 20th century, you have been asked to read a work politically, and you try to read more than what is there in the text, and that is why close reading became very important and famous. And then you had the reader bringing in things from outside, and then you had the rise of the reader response. So but then reader response has its limits. It cannot rob the creator himself of the whole point of writing. Otherwise I can sort of find out associations and deductions from everywhere and nowhere. So that kind of a reading is obviously politically motivated, because once you do a scandal, you become famous. These are the reasons, basically. That's why you see all these old texts being read in new light. There has to be a stop somewhere.
Yeah, then perhaps then everyone has their own criticisms. There is no single. Uh, yes.
Well,
What
uh,
would you
the
say?
yeah, well, the fact that Shakespeare's company was named the King's Men tells us that how pro mainstream they were. They were first of all trying to please the king only, and everything that stands for the mainstream.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we should not
Even then,
forget the
yeah,
patronage. We should not
yeah,
forget
yeah.
that everything revolves around that patronage.
But even then, I think of Shakespeare as someone quite naughty. I mean, he would poke fun at everyone, even at the expense of his uh, own head. So
Yeah.
yeah, there are always those naughty comments that tell otherwise. But yeah,
About
he was a
naughtiness,
mainstream writer.
remember one biographical fact about Shakespeare is that he ran away with a wife. And he ran away, and he was being chased down. So, which means that he is not such a religious person. He will not try to give any religious didactic sort of sentiments in his writing. If at all he does that, he knows that there is a market value in doing that. So, he will do that.
Yeah, and like the very fact that writing the last scenes of your play just before the play, that so that it cannot be stolen by anyone or it cannot be plagiarized, uh, does show that it was kind of money that was somewhere more important for him. The money that it would make it. He was writing for money to some extent, rather than being. He was no political activist.
If you
More than
look at,
any other playwriter, actually, he
hmm,
was the richest playwriter.
Yes.
and notice that he has not published his work. He's not interested in publishing it. He's like, okay. And I mentioned it clearly that after death, his works have been published. So, which means that there was no political motivation in work.
Okay. Okay, so Imtiaz says, can we see Hamlet from psychoanalytical point of view? We have discussed a lot about it, and yes, you can if you feel free. You can just read Lacan and impose Lacan and impose Freud and impose anyone you want on Shakespeare. But at least first read Shakespeare for Shakespeare.
For Shakespeare.
Uh, Again, there are many things. There is the text, and then there is the context. So the text is also important. It is a wonderful session. Most of my doubts have been
Thanks,
answered to
thanks a lot.
perfection. Thank you. So
This
thanks
question,
Venkat, for that lovely message.
yeah, this question, does the purpose of catharsis really work through tragedies? Anupam Devnath is asking.
Yeah. So yeah, heavy question and nice answer. I'll give you that.
Does
Uh,
not the emotion, I will read the later half of the question,
hmm.
does not the emotion which lead to catharsis continue to exist? And if it makes us feel good, then we will seek it out again in the future.
Yeah, and I would like to answer this question from the performance studies point of view.
Yeah, that is a different thing. So if you remember in the talk, I mentioned that you cannot have a definite ending to a Shakespearean tragedy. Shakespeare will always leave you thinking about what he did on the stage. And it is in that sense that you will always have this cathartic effect go to your home with you. Even if you look at a simple rendering, Heather, you try to find out the meaning of, if you're a sensitive reader, if you're watching it for its literary value, then you will look at that movie for even the songs that the movie has. So it cannot be that the moment you've seen that play, you're exhausted of the emotion, and it's not like there's some ejection of previous emotions. That will continue even when you go to your home and then you think back about that artistic creation. Yeah, that's my
Yeah, from a psychoanalytical angle, the compulsion, right? Repetition compulsion that Freud speaks of in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Human beings like to reenact uh, their own crisis, their own trauma. I think the urge to go and revisit a tragedy is coming from that only. Most Elizabethan audience will assume knew the plot of Hamlet, so it's not like they're going to see Hamlet to know what is the end of Hamlet. They know it already, but then again they are going and visiting Hamlet again and again because of this certain repetition compulsion.
Yeah, and when you talk of repetition and imitation, even uh, Aristotle, before like the first part of Aristotle's Poetics, is completely dedicated to this idea of imitation and how human beings find pleasure in imitating. Approaching this very idea from the performance studies point of view, someone like Richard Schechner would say that there is an is performance and there is an as performance. So when you act, it is performance. You say that when you're on stage, you say that, yeah, I'm acting. When you are, even in your life, you are actually acting various roles, and that you have to read them as performance. When you move out of that and you kind of assess that, then you read it as performance. Now, what I was trying to why I brought performance studies here is that performance studies is very much a new field when we see in literature studies or literary studies, and theater moving out of drama and kind of involving the audience, the entire Breckian idea of epic theater. But even in this idea of the catharsis, we see that there is a certain emotional involvement of the audience that is kind of projected, or that is kind of hinted at, which later with performance studies you kind of get to see that the audience is much more involved in an epic theater of Brecht, or later you also have artwork. So what I feel is that here is just the beginning, and you find that this is obviously taken forward, and as Nisarga rightly pointed out from the psychoanalytical point of view, that you usually repeat your crisis, and that repetition kind of also prepares you perhaps for that crisis, if I'm putting it correctly. Because there is Hans Lehmann in his book mentions this example of forced entertainment. So there is this group called the forced entertainment. They will compulsory bring the audience into the performance and make the audience realize that, okay, you are not living in, this is not a makeshift world, and you are living in reality, and I'll make you realize that this is your body. So that is what happens actually with Shakespeare, with any tragedy. They make you realize there is this pity for someone who is really high. So if this can happen to an aristocracy, if this can happen to someone so powerful, who am I? I'm just a common man. So that direction, that fear is towards yourself, that fear is for yourself. And once that fear psychology is repeated, you kind of get ready for the crisis in real life. So I think this imitation does take place, and this imitation makes you ready for the crisis in the real life. So it's more like, ab itna bar dimag mein ye repeat ho chuka hai that I can face anything that of that magnitude. So okay, those, for those who were late, we'll share the video. Also, there's someone who's asking for discussion of syllogisms. I think it has been a very lengthy session, and all of us need a break. I can share that perhaps we can have a session on syllogisms itself, because syllogism, I cannot explain it in a line. You know, you have to explain what a subject is, what a predicate is, and then all the four forms that it takes, and what is the relation of these four forms. And you want me to jump to subaltern and how the subaltern relations work, that is like comes way late in syllogism. So what I'll do is perhaps we can have a different session, because I think all of us are tired by now. My head is literally throbbing. Uh, so yeah, thank you for being there. And also, if you want to join us for a guided course, we also offer a 6 months course. Now that is not a compulsion. If you want the free sessions, it is always open to you. The free sessions will happen for an hour. We have already exceeded an hour, but we have planned it for an hour every week. So every Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, as it suits the instructor, we'll pick up a course. So we'll pick up a subject and we'll have this free session for you. But those who are interested in a full-time guided course for NET, so we have a 4 months preparation plus 1 month of critical and critical revisiting of what we have learned, and again real assessment, real-time assessment and feedback, and 1 month of training you for PhD entrance examination. So this is a 6 months course, which is again a paid course that is 10,000 rupees for both paper 1 and paper 2. For paper 2 it's just 6,000, and for paper 1 it is 1,000. There are only 30 seats, because we don't want to take in many people and then don't come with results. We want good results. So our first batch will just have 30 people. So this is the paid course. And if you don't want the paid course, you will always have these sessions, and you'll always have access to us here. You can always ask questions here. Literary devices, yes, we'll do it all, but again, that will take time. Yeah, because we all are research scholars, and we are already kind of saddled and strained when it comes to work. So yeah, thank you. We'll take your suggestions. We'll take your suggestions, and we'll come up with these sessions on these topics that you mentioned. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you for being with us for 1.5 hours. And thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I'm ending the meeting now. Thank you, Amrit. Thank you, Nisarga. And Amrit, thank you for the wonderful presentation. The presentation would be shared. As you pointed out, there are some mistakes because we have done it in a very time-constrained manner. So yeah, there are mistakes, and we are human, but we'll correct the mistakes and we'll put it on Facebook for you. And thank you for being so patient and being there with us for 1.5 hours. So thank you, everyone. I'll just end the meeting.